Somewhere in suburban America, a father is standing in his kitchen looking like a man who has just accidentally joined a psychological experiment.
Shock jock husband Eric rules the home like a tyrant. Image-obsessed wife Jessica has to put up with his constant shouting.
Yesterday, his household ran like a military base. Wake up at 6, chores by 7, no television, no sugar, and absolutely no talking back. Today, his wife is gone. In her place stands a stranger who has just announced that chores are canceled because, in her words, children deserve joy.
The wives have agreed to swap partners and homes for 2 weeks to see what they can learn about their own lives.
The kids are eating pizza on the couch. Bedtime is now a suggestion. And somewhere in the corner, a television producer is quietly watching the situation unfold like a scientist observing two chemicals that definitely should not be mixed together. Welcome to Wife Swap. When the show first appeared in the early 2000s, it was presented as a wholesome social experiment. Two families from completely different lifestyles would exchange wives for 2 weeks, exposing everyone to new values, new perspectives, and maybe even a little personal growth. At least that was the theory. In practice, the show often looked less like a sociology project and more like someone had carefully engineered the most awkward family reunion imaginable.
Oh, I just can't hack it.
What's it like living with a man who spends more time in front of the mirror than with his own family?
Strict households collided with chaotic ones. Religious families met outspoken atheists. Minimalists met people who owned 17 decorative swords. And halfway through every episode, the visiting wife was given the power to rewrite the entire household rulebook.
I've decided it's like living with golden balls, posh and becks. I can't fucking stand it in here.
Which raises a very simple question. Was Wife Swap really about understanding other people's lives, or was it just one of reality television's most elegant ways of watching two worldviews collide on national television? To understand why Wife Swap became such a cultural phenomenon,
Don't shout at
Right,
me!
well then you fucking take back everything that you said against my wife and me now.
you have to go back to the early 2000s, a time when television executives collectively discovered a magical formula. Take normal people. Put them in uncomfortable situations. Film the consequences. Reality television was exploding. Shows like Survivor and Big Brother had already proven that audiences were deeply fascinated by watching strangers navigate awkward social experiments on camera.
To resist.
It's over.
Go over there with it.
No, I won't. Let me in my ass. Let me in my ass!
Mum.
Networks realized that scripted drama was expensive, but real people arguing in a living room? That was cheap, unpredictable, and often even more entertaining.
Dawn's a kept woman. She never works, doesn't pay the bills, and doesn't even have a bank account.
So in 2003, British producer Stephen Lambert introduced a deceptively simple idea on Channel 4 in the United Kingdom. What if two families swapped wives for 2 weeks? Not celebrities, not actors, just ordinary households with completely different lifestyles. A strict religious family might suddenly find their home run by a laid-back party mom. A minimalist household might be forced to adapt to someone who believed that decorative flamingos were an essential part of interior design. The show premiered in the UK in 2003 and quickly became a massive success. Viewers were fascinated by the culture clashes, the awkward dinners, and the inevitable moment when the visiting wife realized that the household she had just entered operated on rules that felt completely alien. The concept was so popular that the British version even won a BAFTA award shortly after its launch, which is probably the closest reality television has ever come to being described as prestigious.
You know, you don't seem like the money-hungry semi-stripper who's usually on Fox. Why do you do it?
Well, I thought there was no further way I could humiliate my husband, and then this opportunity came along.
Naturally, American television executives saw this and immediately thought, yes, we should absolutely make our own version of this. In 2004, the American network ABC launched its own adaptation of Wife Swap, and it quickly pulled in millions of viewers every week. At its peak, episodes regularly attracted 8 to 10 million viewers, turning the show into one of the defining reality programs of the mid-2000s. And at first glance, the show looked almost wholesome. Families claimed they learned from each other. Parents said the experience opened their minds. Occasionally, someone even admitted they might adopt a few of the other household's habits.
Despite not contributing financially, Dawn still spends hundreds of pounds on her designer wardrobe.
But the real secret behind the show's popularity wasn't the learning. It was the conflict. Because the entire format was built on one irresistible promise. If you place two completely incompatible lifestyles under the same roof, eventually something is going to explode. And for a few glorious years in the mid-2000s, millions of viewers tuned in every week to watch exactly that happen. For a while, Wife Swap looked unstoppable.
He spends a lot of time on himself. He's more like a woman. It's more like living with another woman.
The formula was beautifully simple and suspiciously effective. Every episode followed the same structure. Two families with completely incompatible lifestyles swapped wives for 2 weeks. During the first week, the visiting wife had to follow the household rules exactly. Then came the twist. During week 2, she could rewrite the rules entirely. And that's when the emotional fireworks usually began.
Nails and manicured, my feet pedicured. Right, if you could just do the normal girls, tidy my nails up.
Strict households suddenly had to follow rules written by someone who believed bedtime was a social construct. Free-spirited homes were suddenly subjected to chore schedules that looked like they had been drafted by a Victorian headmaster. Inevitably, someone cried, someone yelled, and someone stared directly into the camera with the quiet expression of a person realizing they had made a terrible life decision.
A six-figure sum running his own roofing business, playing a round of golf, or enjoying a night out with the boys.
For the first few seasons, audiences loved it. But behind the scenes, the first cracks were already starting to show. In 2005, journalists began reporting that the so-called social experiment wasn't quite as natural as it appeared. Reports revealed that producers sometimes asked participants to reenact arguments so the cameras could capture them properly. In some cases, even the famous New Rules segment, the moment where the visiting wife supposedly redesigned the household, was partially guided by production. In other words, the great sociological experiment had something even more powerful than sociology. A producer with a clipboard. Former participants later claimed that producers actively pushed them to behave more dramatically. One participant said he was encouraged to act angrier and more confrontational because, as
Mick works 6 days a week putting up fences and earns around £300, which doesn't leave much money for luxuries.
As the production team politely explained, conflict makes better television. Which, to be fair, might be the most honest sentence ever spoken in the history of reality TV. Despite the criticism, the show kept growing. By the mid-2000s, the American version regularly pulled in millions of viewers every week.
The Litchfields are less interested in spending money and more content spending time together as a family.
The format spread internationally, spawning spin-offs across Europe and beyond. But the controversies kept piling up. In 2005, one American participant filed a $10 million lawsuit against the network, claiming the show had deliberately misled him during production and humiliated him on national television. The network responded in the calm legal language of television contracts. "You signed the paperwork, buddy." The case ultimately went nowhere. Then things got even more uncomfortable. In 2010, a teenager who appeared on the show sued the producers, arguing she had been portrayed as a spoiled villain while allegedly being fed lines during filming. The case was eventually settled, but it reinforced what viewers were already beginning to suspect. Reality television might not be entirely real. Meanwhile, the show's signature culture clash formula was becoming harder to ignore. Episodes frequently paired families with wildly opposing beliefs: conservative versus liberal, religious versus secular, strict parenting versus total chaos. In theory, the idea was to encourage understanding between different lifestyles. In practice, it often looked like someone had simply asked the casting department to find the two most incompatible households in the country.
For Mick and Lisa, clothes are for comfort and beauty is only skin deep.
And then lock them in a house together. Critics increasingly argued that the show wasn't really about empathy at all. It was about spectacle. A televised culture war where the entertainment value came from watching people argue about morality, parenting, religion, and occasionally the proper way to load a dishwasher. And sometimes the situation became genuinely disturbing. In 2006, production on the British version was temporarily halted after a participant accused someone connected to the host family of assault during filming. The allegation was later withdrawn, but the incident generated intense media scrutiny and raised uncomfortable questions about how far the show was willing to push participants into unfamiliar environments. Then there were the stories that surfaced long after the camera stopped rolling. Several former participants later became involved in scandals or tragedies that brought renewed attention to their appearances on the show. One particularly devastating case involved the Stockdale family, who had previously appeared on an episode featuring an extremely strict religious household. Years later, the family became the center of a tragic domestic incident that shocked the public and once again dragged wife swap back into the headlines. To be clear, the show wasn't responsible for those events. But when a program builds its entire premise around showcasing dysfunctional family dynamics,
it's finally time for the wives to meet their new families.
people inevitably start asking uncomfortable questions when things go wrong. By the late 2000s, critics were becoming openly hostile toward the show. Commentators described it as a culture war simulator, a program that exaggerated stereotypes because stereotypes were easier to turn into television drama. And audiences were starting to notice the pattern. Each episode followed the same emotional blueprint: culture shock, escalating arguments, the dramatic rule change, a screaming match around the dinner table, and finally, a strangely wholesome ending where everyone insisted they had learned something valuable from the experience. The show claimed it was about understanding, but by this point, the illusion was starting to crack. Because when every episode ends with a life lesson but spends 40 minutes showing people yelling at each other, it starts to look less like a social experiment and more like a very efficient factory for manufacturing family arguments. By the time Wife Swap tried to come back in 2019, something awkward had happened. The world had changed. In the early 2000s, the show could still pretend it was a quirky little social experiment. Viewers were curious about how other families lived. The idea of watching different lifestyles collide felt new, unpredictable, maybe even a little educational. But once the formula became obvious, the magic disappeared. Because when you watch enough episodes, you start to notice something strange. The show isn't actually discovering differences between families, it's manufacturing them.
In Dagenham, Mick's cooking the family a meal, but wonders if it will be enough to impress his new wife, Dawn.
The casting became increasingly obvious. Producers weren't looking for ordinary households anymore. They were looking for extremes: hyper-strict religious families, chaos-driven, anything-goes parents, families that ran their homes like boot camps, families that looked like a permanent sleepover. The goal wasn't balance. The goal was maximum collision. At some point, the show stopped feeling like a social experiment and started feeling like a reality TV version of a chemistry lab where producers mixed together the two most volatile substances they could find and waited for the explosion. And once audiences realized that, the illusion collapsed, because the entire premise depended on viewers believing the show was at least somewhat authentic. But reports about staged scenes, producer interference, and manipulated arguments slowly chipped away at that credibility. Participants described being pushed into confrontations or having their personalities exaggerated for television. Once people start thinking your reality show is just scripted chaos.
Very nice. She's getting on blinding with the children. It makes me feel happy. She's made me feel relaxed.
The whole format becomes harder to take seriously. But the real problem wasn't just authenticity, it was tone. Early 2000s reality television had a very specific kind of cruelty baked into it. The genre thrived on embarrassment, humiliation, and conflict. Watching strangers struggle on camera was half the entertainment. Back then, audiences laughed. Today, it mostly just feels uncomfortable. Modern viewers are far more sensitive to how reality TV treats its participants. Stories about mental health, exploitation, and producer manipulation have become part of the public conversation. Shows that once looked like harmless chaos now look suspiciously like emotional stress tests designed for ratings. And Wife Swap suddenly started to look like one of the clearest examples of that entire era. Not a thoughtful cultural experiment, more like a weekly televised argument. By the time networks attempted revivals and spin-offs, the format already felt outdated. The core premise, forcing ideological opposites to live together for dramatic conflict.
Can't wait.
A babysitter has been booked, and tonight will be a change from Lisa's traditional Friday night in with the family.
Had been done so many times that the outcomes were completely predictable. Strict family meets chaotic family. Arguments happen. Someone cries. Everyone claims they learned something.
Your two families will exchange wives for a month.
Disgusting. Young man, I'm going to turn that cartoon into homework.
Roll credits. After enough episodes, it stopped feeling like reality television and started feeling like a script that had been photocopied 100 times. And that's the real reason Wife Swap struggles today. Not because the idea was terrible, but because the trick only works once. The first time you see two families with completely different lifestyles collide, it feels fascinating. The 50th time, it just feels like television producers figured out the fastest way to turn family disagreements into entertainment, which raises a slightly uncomfortable question. If the show was always built on conflict, was it ever really about understanding in the first place? Looking back, Wife Swap was built on a surprisingly optimistic idea.
You should go down to my garden. That's a Chelsea flower show.
The show claimed that if two completely different families spent time living each other's lives, they might learn something. Maybe the strict household would loosen up a little. Maybe the chaotic household would discover the benefits of structure. Maybe everyone would walk away with a better understanding of how other people live. And sometimes that actually happened. But those moments were never really the point. Because if the real goal had been empathy, the show probably wouldn't have spent most of its runtime escalating arguments at the dinner table. It wouldn't have built entire episodes around culture clashes that were clearly designed to explode. What Wife Swap really perfected wasn't understanding. It was conflict. It took ordinary differences between families.
Yes.
What, a woman?
Yeah, because you're not a man.
Is that right?
You're not a man.
I'm more man than you'd ever know.
Religion, parenting styles, lifestyle, and turned them into a weekly pressure cooker for entertainment. And for a while, millions of viewers loved watching that experiment unfold. But eventually, the illusion wore off. Once audiences realized the show wasn't discovering conflict but carefully engineering it, the format stopped feeling insightful and started feeling predictable. The experiment hadn't failed. It had simply revealed what reality TV had quietly been doing all along, turning ordinary human disagreements into primetime entertainment. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to BuzzKill TV and let me know which reality show should be the next victim of a perfectly reasonable internet autopsy.